First and foremost, just wanted to sort of echo that, we are in this week of World Humanitarian Day. World Humanitarian Day was on the 19th of August. And it's really seen as a day to commemorate and to celebrate those who work particularly in the humanitarian sector, but also those who've lost their lives in the humanitarian sector. And for the UN, it's really around understanding the loss of life that is there, and they commemorate a number of their colleagues who passed away. It's actually quite interesting that we're having this presentation today, because on the 22nd of August, which was on Saturday, we celebrated within the Red Cross, we celebrated the anniversary of the adoption of the first Geneva Convention, which was on the 22nd of August, 1864, which was the first Geneva Convention that was adopted to protect the wounded and sick on land, as well as the first national Red Crescent society to be ever formed. So I think it's quite symbolic that we're here today to really share those ideas and those premises, and to share a little bit about what humanitarian principles mean. But one thing that I really wanted to also make this much more practical for people here, because I'm not really certain how much people are engaged in the process in the humanitarian sector, whether you're directly working as a volunteer or with an organization, or whether you're just simply interested in understanding what it is. So I really wanted to make this much more practical and much more rooted in what you can do in your daily lives, because I think one of the things that we wanted to debunk is this myth that the humanitarian principles is something different, something foreign. They're not applicable to us in our daily lives. So I want to touch upon what the humanitarian principles are. I want to touch upon how we within the Red Cross and Red Crescent world abide by them, because they are part of our principles that we work with. But more importantly, how you as individuals can also be humanitarians in your own way. There's no special badge or status that is given to those who work in organizations or work formally in the humanitarian sector, because everyone in their own life can be a humanitarian and an agent of change. I'm also going to try, as I said, to make this as interactive as possible. So I will hope that Dominica and Justina can help me if there are specific questions that come up regards that they want clarity just on a slide, then please feel free to stop me, and I'm happy to kind of discuss it, because it is supposed to be interactive. But let me start off with a question, and the question is, for those of you who are not necessarily familiar with the term humanitarian principles, and I also see there's a number of my colleagues from different Red Cross societies that are there, so I presume that you should all be familiar with this. But what comes to mind when you hear the phrase humanitarian principles? Quickly, just anything, if you want to type something up in the chat, and then Dominica or Justina, if you can just let me know what people are saying, because I can't necessarily see the chat when I'm sharing the screen, which is a little bit of a challenge when you have Zoom. So if anyone is typing anything, please do let me know, just to get a sense of what people are saying. So what comes to mind when you hear the phrase humanitarian principles?
Yes, feel free to type your answers into the chat section, and we will read them out loud. Yes, does anyone have an answer to what comes to mind?
I have one from Monica, who's said treating people with dignity and respect. Okay, good.
Anyone else?
Okay, let me ask another question. Have people heard of the concept of humanitarian principles? Is there anyone who hasn't heard of it? Again, I don't know whether they have a raise a hand feature on your thing, but again, just very quickly.
Yes, we have another answer,
Yeah.
set of rules accepted by community.
Okay.
Is what comes to mind.
Right. Excellent. Great. So, and I think those two answers that we've had are very much in keeping with what the spirit of the humanitarian principles are. I think that you have really sort of shown that, when we talk about humanitarian principles, I mean, it's not rocket science, right? It's not something that is coming out of nowhere. So let me perhaps share some thoughts. So let me now ask another question. So when you think, or when you hear the word humanitarian principles, or you think about this in action, okay, now, hold on. Now I need to. Okay, when you hear this in action, what type of things come to mind in terms of images in your mind, right, or things you've seen on TV? So you might have seen this as a manifestation of concept of humanitarian principles, right? You might see this. This is a very topical conversation currently because of the number of deaths that are happening, particularly of those crossing the channel to the UK. You might see this. Again, quite topical now with the current COVID scenario. You might see this, which is aid convoys moving. But what about this? Do you think that is, is that a picture that comes to your mind when you think about humanitarian principles? Or maybe this picture? Or maybe this picture? What you will see is that there's a spectrum of understanding what humanitarian principles are. There's a spectrum of the types of things that can constitute action of or implementing humanitarian principles in your own daily lives. And that, for me, is the crux of what I wanted to share with you today, that humanitarian principles exist everywhere for all times and contexts, even though the assumption is that they're only times of disaster crisis or the only times of emergency response. They're applicable for everyone. So everyone can be a humanitarian. So if we really want to start understanding what the humanitarian principles are, we really have to understand why would this body of knowledge exist? Because the humanitarian principles, as many of you also said, but also as we've seen in many of the pictures, they are the basis for all humanitarian action. They're applicable to virtually all humanitarian world bodies, organizations that aspire to be humanitarian. They inspire humanitarian action, both in times of emergencies and crisis, but also, as I would like to say, in times of non-crisis, non-emergencies. They provide guidelines, rules, as someone said, in controversial and ambiguous situations in which humanitarian actors themselves find themselves. And they're central for humanitarian agencies to establish and maintain access to affected populations during times of disaster. In sort of international codification, there are two resolutions, one from the UN General Assembly and one from our own Red Cross Crescent movement, from which the original concepts of the humanitarian principles derive. So what are the four humanitarian principles that we look at? So the first one that we consider, and this is the primary, this is the important one that really speaks to the concept of humanitarian action. This is around the principle of humanity, that we alleviate, we provide assistance to those who need it. We prevent suffering, which also includes helping to remove negative conditions. We protect life and health, preserve others from suffering, from violence being committed on them. And we provide humane treatment of others, respect for human beings, the concept of human dignity, treating them with dignity and respect, the concept of well-being. This requires an understanding of what compassion is, to treat someone as you wish to be treated, the concept of charity, the concept of friendship, the concept of mutual understanding. It is a people-centered action. It requires the skills of empathy and listening. So that's the first principle. The second principle is on impartiality. And this is the fact that our action as humanitarian actors, agencies, individuals is solely guided by the needs proportional to the degree of suffering and prioritized on the basis of urgency and vulnerability. And there is no discrimination on subjective grounds. That means that we use our judgment based on established rules without taking sides for reason of interests or sympathy. Again, this really means that the heart of the matter is that we have a respect for diversity, we have an open-mindedness, we have an objective analysis of the problem. So we look at the problem, we're not swayed by who's necessarily involved in the problem, we drop our biases. And that is very important for us to ensure that when we treat everyone with respect, we treat everyone without bias. The third one is around neutrality. And so you can see that there's a phase to this, right? Humanity, impartiality, and then you go to neutrality. And this is about ensuring that you enjoy the confidence of all, that you are not allowed to take sides. So you treat people with impartiality, without judgment, without bias. You ensure that you do not take part, you do not take sides. You are prohibited from engaging in controversies of a political, racial, religious, or ideological nature. So you have to exercise the concept of tolerance, non-judgment, discipline. It is also seen sometimes as one of the more difficult and challenging principles, particularly when you are working on the ground in communities that you may come from, that you may know. How do you keep a sense of neutrality? How do you ensure that you're giving to everyone without upsetting people? But this is the core of the work that we're doing in terms of ensuring that we're able to win the trust of everyone and gain access to everyone. And then the final principle is around independence. And that is that whilst you work on neutrality, whilst you work on impartiality, you're serving those that are in need. You also have to ensure that there is no other external pressure that is dictating your action. So there's no political pressure, there's no economic pressure, there's no social pressure. You have to be able to maintain your autonomy to be able to act in conformity with the principles, right? So you cannot let anyone dissuade you. And so as you can see that these four principles are really the crux of how we want to engage in humanitarian action. And these are the principles that you abide by when you work on humanitarian action. And I will just, let me just go back. So just in summary, these are sort of the humanitarian principles and the definitions: humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. And they sound really, really high and visionary. In practice, they can be extremely difficult sometimes to work, particularly when you're working in areas where there's maybe a conflict between two communities, and you're trying to come in to give humanitarian assistance to both communities. And the moment you go to one community, the other community will say, wait, hang on, why did you go to that community? Why did you come to us? Or you work in areas where, for example, there's a conflict between a government and maybe a non-state actor, and the government thinks that you're favoring the non-state actor. And it can just be in terms of natural disasters as well. Sometimes where, you know, you look at those communities that have been hit the most hardest, and they get the immediate response. But sometimes we also have to understand that there are people around that will also suffer. One example that we can give is during the time of the tsunami in 2004, 2005, for those of you who may remember that or not, there was a lot of effort done to help those that were directly affected by the tsunami. And so those are the people who lived on the coastline of most of the countries where the tsunami hit. And so those are the ones who were prioritized. But what a number of agencies perhaps neglected to think about was the fact that maybe 2 or 3 kilometers inland, away from the shore, were communities that were not directly hit by the tsunami, but relied on the communities that lived by the sea for livelihood. Maybe they were fishermen, and so they sold the fish in the markets. And so when the communities by the sea were affected, these communities were also affected. But sometimes you may not have realized that, and so you inadvertently preferred one community over another, and that can also lead to this feeling of not being impartial, not being neutral. It's also sometimes difficult when you have donors, governments, or individuals who say, well, hang on, I gave you my money to do this. How are you accountable? And sometimes it's difficult or it's challenging to try and maintain an independence as well. But these are the principles that we all aspire to as humanitarians and humanitarian agencies. I wanted to really maybe move on to talk about what this means in relation to our work going forward, and what this means for you and how you reflect within your own level of influence, and what this means for us and for the organizations that I work for. So I work for the International Federation for the Red Cross, Red Crescent. That's IFRC. It's the one on the right. We are the third pillar of the Red Cross movement. The first one is the International Committee for the Red Cross, which is the original manifestation of the Red Cross. They are the ones that really came up with the ideas of the Geneva Conventions. As I said, 1864, the first convention of Geneva was adopted, and then a number of national societies have been set up. As governments sign up to the Geneva Conventions, you set up a number of your national Red Cross or Red Crescent Society, who acts as auxiliary to government in humanitarian service, social service, healthcare, first aid. And so we have 192 national Red Cross, Red Crescent societies across the world. The first one was born in 1864. The last one was born last year, where we invited the Marshall Islands as our 192nd national society to join our family. And during times of crisis, wartime, natural disasters, national societies assist the affected civilian population there. And every 4 years, we have an international conference of the Red Cross, Red Crescent, where states that are signatories to the Geneva Convention sit, and we discuss resolutions and ways of working, of better working. Now, within this, the Red Cross has developed its fundamental principles, and this since 1965 has been the key documents that have really helped us to shape our work forward. And it is out of these fundamental principles that the humanitarian principles have been born and developed. And so, if I was to share that, if these are the fundamental principles of the Red Cross. So again, you can see that our goal is humanity, and this is how we elaborate it slightly better than perhaps it is done in terms of humanitarian principles. So we sort of say that our goal is humanity and impartiality. We treat everyone with respect. We treat everyone regardless of the bias. We use the tools of neutrality and independence. So we're not influenced by anyone, and we work regardless of which side. But how? We work through voluntary service. We work through the principles of unity, and we work through the principles of universality. And this for us is the key element and the crux of what makes up the Red Cross system, the Red Cross volunteers. All of us abide by this, and all of us live this in our daily lives. But these principles are not just for people or for members or volunteers of the Red Cross. These are for everyone. This is why we talk about integrating this into whatever decision-making process that is there, integrating it into operations and actions, encouraging behavioral change by being a living example. So we talk around the Red Cross volunteers being living examples of these principles to the wider society, so that everyone in society can be a humanitarian, can be a volunteer. So if I was just to share the fundamental principles, which are comprised of obviously of the 4 humanitarian principles and then the three additional principles that we have, you can see some of the values that we ascribe to that help to shape humanitarian action, that allow us to work on the protection of life, health, human dignity, respecting others, the acceptance of responsibility to help others without discrimination. You can see that voluntary service is really part of that that process, and this is just another manifestation of this, because as I said before, there is a need to have a behavior change in terms of how we want people in society to really act. We want them to have this aspect of intercultural dialogue, social inclusion, respect of age and gender, respect of diversity, respect of the other person, right? We want them to have the skills of active listening, critical thinking, mediation, nonviolent communication. These are all born from the values that emanate out of the principles. And so the question is that we want people to really inculcate these values to become better humanitarians. So the humanitarian principles, the humanitarian values belongs to everyone. And this change is what we want everyone in society to know and to live. You need, and we need, to live the values which encourage respect for other human beings through willingness to work together to find solutions to communities' problems in the spirit of voluntarism. And that is the second half of what I wanted to share with you today, that all the principles that I've shared with you, all the kind of concepts that I've talked about, which really apply maybe to, or you may think really applies just to humanitarian organizations or the Red Cross or the UN. It doesn't. It applies to all of us. It applies to every single one of us on a daily basis. Anyone can be a humanitarian. And we saw this with COVID, right? We saw this where there was a need for self-organizing, where people stepped in because they felt there was not the usual suspects, whether it was the government or NGOs or the UN, were not able to meet those needs. And the absence of those usual forms of support, they stepped in to help. So if you checked in on your neighbor, if you picked up groceries or made masks or did errands for someone who struggled with being quarantined or being sick, or maybe had other challenges, maybe lost their jobs because of the lockdown, if you volunteered, if you did anything to help others, congratulations, you are a humanitarian. And we're seeing this on a daily basis. Whenever there's a crisis, it is the local people that will step up and that will respond, regardless of whether there's organizations there or not. And it is that spirit that we want to encourage, and that spirit that we want to get people to continuously live. We saw this in Beirut. Imagine 2 weeks ago, if you remember, that horrific blast. That was something like out of a movie that that affected Beirut, affected almost 300,000 people. But people managed to dust themselves off. Next day, they were in the streets cleaning, organizing, providing support to their neighbors. Whenever there's a flood, whenever there's any issue, you will see that same level of volunteer service coming out there. And these are the countless examples of ordinary people doing extremely humanitarian activities without the need for title or a mandate. They help out because it's the right thing to do. So we thank them, we congratulate them, we salute them, because you, and though if you've done it, and you know people who've done it, they have embraced the importance of humanity, especially during this time. And it takes just one person to do that. It just takes one person to be that change. So let me finish off with a story of something that really speaks to me around being that change. So there's a man who comes home after work, extremely tired. He's had a long day at work. And he has a 6-year-old son who's, when he sees the father come home, he's really excited because he wants to play with the father, and he wants to, you know, get the father's attention. The father's really tired, and what he wants to do is just sit, maybe read the newspaper, and have a cup of coffee. And he tries to do that, and the son keeps on coming back saying, I want to play with you, I want to play with you, I want to play with you. So the man gets really frustrated. And so he goes to a magazine, and he sees an atlas, a map of the world, and he thinks, okay, you know what I'll do? I will play a game with my son. So he goes, fine. He tears the picture of the map of the world, and he tears it into small bits. And he gives it to his son and says, okay, now make this like a jigsaw puzzle. Build this picture for me. And so he thinks, well, you know, this kid is going to maybe take about half an hour or an hour to do this. I'll have my peace and quiet. Within 10 minutes, the son comes back and says, I'm done. And the father goes, what do you mean you're done? He goes, no, I constructed the picture. And he goes, how did you construct the picture? He goes, well, on the other side of the picture of the world is a picture of a man. So what I did is I just followed the picture of the man, which was easy to do, and I got the picture of the world. And for me, this really is the crux of what I wanted to share with you today. That if you want to change the world, or if you want to build a new world, or you want to improve the world, then we start with the individual. Thank you so much for giving me the time and an opportunity to share some thoughts with you. I now leave it to any questions and answers or any clarifications, or just a general discussion on this. So with that, Dominica, I'll hand back to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That was a very interesting presentation of yours. Thank you for sharing it. And now we have some time for the questions. So everyone feel free to type them down in the chat section of this webinar. I can see that we had one regarding the basic terms used in the humanitarian realm.
Okay, so from Nawaz Khan, yes, I'm happy to. Is there a particular question about the basic terms?
So you can type it down and we will read them out loud and try to answer to you. Yeah. And also we had another point made by Violetta saying that I would connect humanitarian principles, the field of humanitarian principles, with all SDGs. Do you have any comment on that? How do they connect in your view?
Actually, I mean that's a very good point. I mean, and I think it really speaks to what is an ongoing discussion at the moment around the connection between the humanitarian world and the development world. But I think you're right that if you take the very spirit of what the humanitarian principles are about, which is around humanity, which is around impartiality, I think you will find that there is a connection with the application of the SDGs and what we need to do to be able to apply that. So, you know, the humanitarian principles are the framework in which you would operate, and then the SDGs are a target that you need to reach and you need to work on. It's a mandate that I think has been given worldwide. So I do take that point, Violetta, that very much so. I think, you know, the humanitarian principles would drive you to achieve the SDGs in that sense.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Any more questions?
I saw something around do no harm. I think just, Diana, thank you so much for that. I think that's not necessarily one of the humanitarian principles, but in the work that we do, we have to ensure that a do no harm principle, that's the minimum, in fact, and we talk about that within our work, is we talk around the fact that a minimum aspect is to do no harm, to ensure that we do not create a conflict, or we do not exacerbate an existing conflict. So we have to be aware of that. And so, you know, one of the tools that you would use when you do one of these operations is to also do what we call a context analysis or conflict sensitivity analysis that will enable you to understand what you're getting into, particularly if you're coming from outside. You know, most of our operations are where people respond, and then there are people from outside that come to help them. So those coming from outside should also be aware of the underlying dynamics, the underlying challenges. You know, for example, if you have two communities that are in conflict with each other, you need to understand that, so that you don't exacerbate conflict, right? You don't exacerbate, or you don't prefer one over the other. You need to understand that. So that understanding or doing that analysis is to ensure that there's a do no harm process. So in that sense, it is one of the underlying sort of work, but it's not necessarily, it can't be said it's one of the principles in terms of how we understand the humanitarian principles.
Mm-hmm. We also have another question. How do you balance among different societies to ensure the safe understanding and implementation? How does the humanitarian action work in?
Okay, I mean, so from the Red Cross perspective, obviously, we as the Federation, we are the secretariat for the 192 national societies, right? So we work across all 192 national societies, working with them to build a capacity to help them understand what they need to do. So in that sense, our role is to really provide that level of knowledge and that advocacy that will help national societies to really implement that work. But, you know, as a Red Cross or a Red Crescent national society, you are really there to you abide by your fundamental principles. So this is part and parcel of who you are. So you cannot have and I think that's the beauty of the Red Cross Red Crescent movement. Even if you're in Lithuania, or you're in Armenia, or you're in the Marshall Islands, or you're somewhere in Africa or wherever, all of you abide by the same fundamental principles, and you understand that. You understand what it means. So I think it's part and parcel of your understanding, your training, your knowledge, and so that is part of what our work is about. Now, obviously, if there are departures away from that, then you would try and address that in a way that makes the national, you would hold national societies accountable for that. Now, in terms of other humanitarian agencies who are not part of the Red Cross or even part of the UN, that's a little bit more difficult, right? Because I think that's really up to the national, the humanitarian agencies themselves. And this is where you work with, this is where accountability to states and accountability to other agencies come up in terms of how nationals, how organizations understand and implement and abide by the humanitarian principles.
Right. Also, we have another comment from Stasis Donis saying, thanks, Amjad. I like a lot your approach to explain humanitarian principles through three key aspects: goals, tools, and how. Maybe it is not a question, rather my reflection and understanding that it is impossible to reach goal without tools and plan how to do it actually. Thanks. It is very clear to explain principles in a logic chain and complex.
Great, thank you, Sasas. Absolutely, no. I think for us, and one of the key things is, if you, like I said, if you are a volunteer, if you're being a volunteer and you're going out there, understand that you are implementing and you're implementing humanitarian principles in your work, or you should be implementing the humanitarian principles in your own daily life. So the action part of it is being a volunteer.
Mm-hmm. And also one more question, asking how can you educate or raise awareness about humanitarian principles in post-conflict societies who have just suffered the disaster, and how you could build the trust in principles as such?
That's a very good question. It's a very difficult question as well, right? I think part of it is, it's a variety of things, right? So first and foremost, what I would sort of say is that, and COVID has taught us this, right? COVID has taught us that no country or no society is immune from any type of disaster, right? We may think that we live in a disaster-free world, but actually no. COVID has taught us that we ourselves, where I'm based in Geneva, we as well suffered. Maybe not in the same degree, but we also suffered there. So I think first and foremost, the education of humanitarian principles, and this is something that the Red Cross does in many parts of the world, but also, is the promotion of what we call humanitarian education, the teaching of the principles and values. So teaching this in schools, informally, formally, so that people get to understand that. And I think that is important. So I talk about first before a crisis happens, right? So before a crisis happens, I think there is a lot more investment that needs to be done in that type of training, that type of education. And so, this is why I was very insistent that every one of us is a humanitarian, and so the responsibility is on every one of us to live those humanitarian values and to teach those humanitarian values, right? So what you guys have learned today, it's a small thing. Please share that. That's the first one, right? The first one is that during the times of the actual crisis or conflict, when there is this aspect, it is incumbent upon us as the agencies that are responding to live those values, to ensure that we are doing that work, right? To ensure that we are abiding by these, so people see that there's not a departure from what we are saying and what we are doing, and that goes as well from our organization, but also individually. Because if people see me in a Red Cross T-shirt, and I'm saying something, but I'm actually doing something else, that also will reflect negatively. So I think it's important that we need to ensure that we live those examples through our work. Then after the crisis, once again, it's coming back to creating that space for discussion and education. So it's for me, it's a cycle. You need to be able to do this at all times, so that when it does come to the crisis, people understand that. But very basically as well, during times of crisis, you will have for the affected communities, you will have opportunities to share the information about the principles. You will have opportunities for the communities to provide feedback so that you're able to meet those needs. So there are different mechanisms that enable the community to be engaged and to understand what this means. But the first and foremost is how you live that in your own life and how you model that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so for you personally, Amjad, maybe, well, you work with these humanitarian principles professionally, but also in your everyday life of yourself. You know, how do you implement these principles yourself? Do you have anything personal maybe to share?
I think first and foremost is like, you know, I would say, for example, one of the key things that would be there is to be able to you step in when someone is in need. That's the first and foremost, right? So and it's a daily exercise for us as well. So we go in, we look at people in need, we see things that are happening around us, and we help it. So for example, if it's someone that needs very simply, you know, it could be someone in the supermarket, an elderly person that is maybe having trouble reading the information that is the produce. You know, that's a very simple one, right? You go in and your first thing is, okay, how can I help this person? Mm-hmm. Right? To perhaps there's been an accident or something else, someone's been hurt. If you know first aid, and by the way, first aid is important for everyone to know. Everyone should know first aid because you have it in your schools, you have it at home, you have it in your families, right? In some cases you can administer first aid because you are first aid trained, right? I think for me it is about that. Is that wherever I go, the way that I treat people, the way that I respect the way that I respect diversity, the way that I respect difference, the way that I engage with people, the way that I respond when people are in need, you have to do that. And it's difficult, by the way. Yeah, it's not easy. It's not something. Every day is things, and every day you will come across someone who's maybe on the street who's asking for money because they're hungry, and then, you know, part of you is thinking, well, are you really in need, or are you part of a gang that there's a gang in town that is begging, or and so you have these questions, right? You have these questions that always are affecting your internal thinking, your conscious. But that's the process of being a humanitarian. That's the process of saying, okay, fine, well, you know, I need to do this. Or, you know, you deal with someone who's different, who's maybe outcast from society, but you know that person is you see the humanity in them. So I think the question that you asked is for me is just how do you continuously remember these and go through the process in your head, because I think that's the most important thing. But it's not easy, and let me also, it's a continuous conversation with yourself, and obviously if you expand it within this thing, that you will find that these are conversations that we have. How can we help? Should we be helping? If someone is, you know, we live in a society nowadays where people don't want to get engaged, right? So if someone is crying or shouting in public, we get embarrassed, we move away, right? We quickly move away because we don't want to be seen there. But and we've heard negative stories as well. But the humanitarian in you would say, well, actually, is there something I can do to help this person, or at least can I find out what's something? So, but it's a conversation you need to have on a daily basis.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And we have another question about what are the differences or similarities between peace education and humanitarian education? What could you comment on that?
That's a very interesting perspective. I think so. The humanitarian education, as we understand it, is really about teaching the principles, humanitarian principles and values to help people be a better humanitarian or better citizen. And so there is no there is no big difference between that and peace education. But peace education is often is much more of a technical concept, and a technique that many agencies and NGOs use, where they're working in specific contexts where they are looking at helping communities understand the concept of conflict resolution, mediation, facilitation, all of those things. So sometimes peace education can be a very technical aspect where you're teaching theories and tools to help people build peace because there's been a conflict, right? But in that sense, there is some overlap in some of the concepts and some of the values between humanitarian education and peace education. But it's really how the different agencies package this, right? At the end of the day, peace education, humanitarian education, all of these are different packages that we as NGOs love to package things, right? We love to package things and call these things ourselves, and in that sense. But the spirit, I think, is often the same. But I would sort of say that the humanitarian education is probably a little bit more wider in terms of the principles and values. So I personally would look at maybe peace education as a derivative of humanitarian education. So it's something that's a little bit more focused and technical, but founded on some of the aspects of humanitarian principle. Because again, when you do peace education, you're also talking about building trust. You're also sort of saying that as peace builders, we need to build trust. We need to be able to engage with each other, which is something very much that we learn within humanitarian principles, the concept of neutrality, the concept of impartiality. These are concepts which also speak to building trust. And so in that sense, I think you're looking at the source being the same, but maybe the directions are different, or the vehicles are different.
All right. Thank you very much for explaining the similarity, the differences between these two things. And I think we've run out of questions already. So I'm leaving maybe the last minute for people to reconsider whether they have anything to ask more. But other than that, thank you very much, Amjad, again for being here with us today and for giving this very interesting and useful presentation for anyone involved or anyone interested, even if remotely in this field. So thank you very much.
No, thank you. Thank you for having me. It was a great honor and pleasure for me to be part of this. And thank you for the questions. And just, whatever, one takeaway is everyone can be a humanitarian, right? There's no special badge that says that I'm just a humanitarian. You're not. Everyone is a humanitarian, and everyone has their responsibility to be a humanitarian. So thank you.
Yes, so I guess that's a beautiful note for the ending. We hope you take this message with you beyond the webinar. So yeah, thank you everyone for joining us. We really appreciate, and thank you, Amjad, once again.
Thank you. Bye. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Spouse and new take.